My name is Devin Rogers. I am a consultant at CapTech, and we're going to be talking about what we can do just shy of code to try and take advantage of multi-select pick lists. Some people here might be a little bit more familiar with the distinctions between clicks versus code. For folks who might be a little bit more green in that, clicks are typically going to be tools that people can leverage in automation just shy of code. It's going to be your examples like your process builder, your workflow rules, your flow builder, even though you could largely argue that flow builder is a cool UI for what you'd be doing with Apex anyway. On the flip side though, Apex is going to include items like custom apps, Lightning Web Components or LWCs. You might see some examples like the LWCs recipes from the Salesforce sample apps. But we're going to talk more specifically about what we had to do for a client in order to bring some further sort of processes into their Salesforce org. I do want to lead here first and say that the original ask was really they had an item called a proposal request form as a part of their processes. The request form was used to contact teams that didn't have Salesforce access and was originally brought in from this SharePoint org. It seemed kind of straightforward at the beginning. Obviously, if you are on the consulting side, you tend to not really tell anyone that you can, yes, automatically do it without taking a look under the hood. So that was really the same here. The idea is that we could do this with a basic flow. Once it's sort of been done and we've had some testing done, we can make iterations to it and improve on its design. But I'm sure, as you saw in the title of this presentation, they were using multi-select pick lists. The problem that we have with this is that these pick list values aren't separated. They're generally returned as one string. So I'm not sure, I thought that'd be slightly more legible, to be honest. But with multi-select pick list values here, in my developer org, we have Office 1, Office 2, Office 3, et cetera, et cetera. These aren't being returned as separate values because they were all selected. They're just separated by a semicolon. And Salesforce can't really read that as just one big value. And again, I do want to tell people that while this is great, if you don't have to use multi-select pick lists, I still would advise against it. But this was something that we had to because this is what our client was already using. And one last caveat, these are all screenshots from my developer org. I was able to basically put this flow and the corresponding pieces with it there, so any screenshots are not actually taken out of the client's organization. So I figured the first sort of pass through would be explaining what's happening as users navigate through this system. Really, we're going to start on what is a screenshot from an opportunity. We added an action that would allow us to invoke this screen flow. And the screen flow had the corresponding name of new proposal request. With just the list of fields available, users had the option to not only populate those requested recipients, the offices that needed to know when a proposal request was being created, but the request type, other information like whether or not we think that a purchase is likely to take place, and even attach any additional attachments. And these documents would be associated with both the opportunity as well as the proposal. Now, when this flow ends, users do receive that link to the newly created proposal. Any recipients that were identified from that multi-select pick list are contacted, and they also receive the attachments that were added during that submission. And so this is one of the ways to approach, and I actually have another consideration that I can mention towards the end of this presentation. But in order to email each group, I just needed some sort of container for these email addresses based off of the requested recipients that were also present. One thing that I'd figured out previously is that you can do a query for queues as a part of your basic flow. So that was sort of the idea that I sort of ran with. For each requested recipient in the multi-select pick list, we had a corresponding queue with an email address. We had that exist because it would be easier for administrators or de facto administrators to be able to access and make changes. But there was still one piece that I hadn't quite figured out. I'm sure plenty of people here know that Google's your friend. So that is where I immediately pivoted to figure out how to separate these values. And it was very timely, but there's a guy by the name of Ikrar Ahmed who posted on help.salesforce probably maybe a month or two earlier with a recommendation. And it was really just separating these values using loops and using formulas. So if any of you spend a lot of time with Excel, this might become a little bit more interesting to you because that is functionally what we're doing here on the back end. So what we have is a multi-select pick list value that is added to a variable. For those who are a little less familiar there, a variable is basically a container for information that can be manipulated. It can be returned back to your flow. It can even be housed and then applied. So really, if you're using flow, variables are going to be a really good way to accomplish a lot of things. So yeah, as you might be able to see, we have a mid as part of the same sort of formula you might expect on the Excel side. We're basically taking a variable that is containing our big group of requested recipients, and we're using a len. And the idea is that this formula is grabbing that first value that was returned in our multi-select pick list, and essentially we're going to go and look for a queue with a corresponding name. From there, we actually had to figure out how to manually build a loop. That is to say, how do we continue to look for additional values that were returned as a part of that multi-select pick list? And so what you can see is probably a very faint screenshot, but this is one example of our flow. We're finding if that variables are found or values are found that are in those variables. We actually will continue to cycle through. There's a variable that actually updates to the most recent value that we're populating. There's another formula that actually updates to the next value inside of our requested recipients. And part of this flow will check now to see if the value that we are evaluating basically matches what was previously run through in the flow. And this is how we're able to essentially continue to loop through these different values, but just as importantly, that allows us to stop looping through. Because otherwise, if there's no, it's basically building a loop from scratch. So Salesforce has to have some sort of way to know when it can actually stop going through these values. Let's see, what is next? And so that was really the best way that we were able to sort of figure out just the sort of bare bones functionality as a part of the flow. But obviously it's client work, so once you get it in front of folks, it's not quite done. And so while we were doing a little bit of our preliminary testing, the project manager actually asked a very good question, which was basically, what should happen if an email address isn't found? And the reason for that is because based off how this flow works, if an email address isn't found, the email just doesn't go. There's not an error that is kicked up that an admin gets. It basically just nothing happens. The user wouldn't know that nothing happened, so it's a lot harder to troubleshoot. And the idea there that I came up with was to basically just slightly overhaul the approach. In addition to the loops that I built manually before, I ended up adding counters. So for each email address or queue item that we were looking for, if a value was found, I would add a counter to one variable. And if the value wasn't found, if there's a null response essentially, I would add a value to a separate variable. And using that to populate one of three potential screens. The user actually gets what is nicely, they actually get, think about the best way to phrase this. But essentially, as a consequence, users will see one of three screens. The first screen actually communicates to our users that all offices were successfully emailed. And that's based off of our counter variable that tracks no email found being 0. Obviously, if there is a 1 there, then we know that there is a problem. And that's how we get to our second screen, where we actually will communicate that some offices have been emailed. In addition to that, we actually are tracking which values are not returning an email address. And so the users actually have the ability to see which requested recipients aren't actually being found. And then lastly, the users are shown a third screen if no offices were able to be emailed. Another reason for thinking through all of this was just because if any of the users decide to make changes to that pick list or make changes to the queues themselves, if they're not practicing that due diligence, this is just another way to maintain that visibility. And here I've got some additional considerations. Custom metadata was one that occurred to me a little bit later. It's, I think, just as practical, and I think on the user side, you don't have a queue that's added as a part of that object. And again, you can add additional fields to it. So it does accomplish the same thing in having a label that can match your requested recipients. And then in addition, you could maybe just add a field that is the container for that email address. Something that you've probably heard a lot today are just managed and unmanaged packages. Our users gave us the feedback that they also wanted the ability to attach those attachments that I mentioned earlier. And one way that we're able to do that is by using the send better email package as a part of this flow. In addition, that gave us a little bit more flexibility as well, just because another feedback item was that they wanted the ability to contain a table for all of these items, which I would have to probably give my wife props on this because she did a lot of HTML in her time as a teenager, just as fun as a hobby. But trying to figure out how to do that as an adult is a little tricky. And luckily, there is a website called HTML Tables, and that is actually how we were able to populate a table inside of the email address, just using the plain text as a text component inside of our flow. And so here we've got our requester's name, anything that we wanted to actually add, even just the code, or in this case, the record ID, a link to the opportunity itself, even keeping track of what email address was sent to from inside of my queues in this case. And I think those are probably the really big items. I think I have a couple other things to talk about here. And at a passing glance, this is what this flow looks like when fully zoomed out. You might be able to see some of the smaller items, but I can actually go into the flow here in just a second, just to give you an idea of what it looks like to have to build a loop from scratch, knowing that that's Salesforce's built-in functionality. And also as a part of this presentation as well, and I'll double back to it to make sure that everyone can see it, but there's just a copy of today's presentation. I've got my LinkedIn, but I also have the URL for that loop through multi-select pick list article that I was reading earlier. Additionally, there's the send better email package, which is incredibly useful. And then the HTML table generation that seems like something worth bookmarking. So let's see here. So what we're looking at is just a quick demo opportunity. If we click on our arrows here, we'll notice that the action, submit proposal request, is right here at the bottom. And clicking on that, we have our, our public use sort of office examples here. They're very descriptive, as I'm sure you can tell. And we'll say here that this is information. Maybe the user just has some questions here. For this request, let's just say it's a proposal. It's just very generic. Background history. Let's say this is a sale. And we'll say that it's been vetted by sales, but we're still not feeling entirely confident about it, so we're going to give that a 50-50 shot. What next? We don't think that this is going to close. It's probably a couple $100 worth of a deal, so we'll just add our solution example. Product concerned. Let's say the good one. Geographical coverage, most of it. And And then these are other areas where we can go ahead and populate different dates. We'll go ahead and enter the 27th for all of these. Once we've populated that and we hit next, we get the option to review any of the values that we've previously entered. And then we can hit next from there. This is where we have the option to upload our files. Due to some of our security changes, I don't have the ability to upload a PDF from my computer. That's for all of our security. Is what I'm going to say, even though it's just a very generic test PDF. You can find those and they're very useful. From there, once I hit next, we can see the new proposal has been successfully created. There's a link here. And we can see that this is the proposal that we in fact just created. Cool. So I think that's really everything that I wanted to discuss. Are there any questions? Yeah, absolutely. Let's go back. Right there. Cool. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you've been having a great Mile High Dreaming.